Hello, Warren Dockter here. At the University of Exeter right now, Professor Richard Toye, and we're just discussing Winston Churchill's autobiographical book, My Early Life. Could you tell us a little bit about this book, Richard?
Well, this is perhaps one of Churchill's most enjoyable books to read. It was published in 1930, just at the time when Churchill was entering his so-called wilderness years, when he was out of office for a long period during the interwar and appeasement period. And this was a book which was sort of steeped, many people say, in imperial nostalgia. This was a book which took the story of his life from his birth or from his first memory up until not long after he entered Parliament. So he ends the book with his marriage to his wife Clementine and says, "I lived happily ever after."
Which, of course, is a favorite among the sort of people that read Churchill books. It's often quoted, for instance, in My Finest Hour, or in The Finest Hour.
Yes, this is a book which is sort of packed with quotes and memorable phrases, and I think one of the most enjoyable things about it actually is its use of irony. So you don't just read this book straight, that you have to see the ways in which Churchill is sometimes being quite playful. And one of my favourite passages is with respect to the Boer War, where Churchill was going off as a journalist to cover the war, and he describes how the boat, desperate for news, they sort of stopped and got some news from a boat that was going in the other direction, and or rather they didn't actually stop and communicate because it was thought too sort of unwise to sort of actually flag down the boat and halt it, and so they merely got sort of a brief message from a kind of a banner held out over the side. And I think what's really enjoyable about the passage is the way in which Churchill sort of presents himself partly as a sort of a young hothead, but also presents himself as being in some ways more wise than the sort of rather incompetent leaders who were leading Britain into the Boer War.
Well, and that brings me on to a sort of interesting point. I mean, the sort of uses of this in a historical sense. I mean, it's an autobiographical book, so I think one of its strengths is the fact that it sort of lets us look into how Churchill inhabited the world and sort of remembered the world, despite the fact that there are sort of mistakes in the way he remembered. He's writing it, like as we had discussed before, much later after the fact. What sort of limitations are there, do you think, in using it as a historical source and trying to understand sort of Churchill and the world he inhabited?
Well, I think on the one hand, we've got to acknowledge its strengths, i.e. that there are certain things, such as his own account of his first memory, which you're obviously not going to get from anywhere else. But equally, there are the vagaries of memory over a long period. I don't think this is one of the books where you can sort of accuse Churchill of really engaging in deliberate misrepresentation or serious selectivity. I think that he was doing the best that he could to remember it as well as he could. But clearly, it is something that's written with the benefit of hindsight, with all the strengths and weaknesses that brings.
Do you think, as well, I mean, I recently read Jonathan Rose's book, The Literary Churchill, and he makes the point that this book comes out, of course, as you said, in Churchill's wilderness years during the fight and campaign for India. And, of course, this features his experiences in India feature largely. How much do you think of the book is written as a sort of political way to make people think about the way India was?
I think, in a way, it's perhaps the least political of his books, in that I mean, of course, the other factor that one has to bear in mind, of course, is that he was writing for money. He had to pay for the upkeep of his house Chartwell in Kent, which absorbed a very large number of resources. But I don't think that one can see this in sort of any very clear or direct way as a sort of an explicit political manoeuvre. Nonetheless, as I argued in my own book, Churchill's Empire, that he begins the book by saying that he was a child of the Victorian age, and therefore presents himself very much as a sort of a repository of old style values, if you like. Now, in a sense, there was obviously an element of truth. He was very much influenced by his Victorian upbringing, but in fact, it was not something which led him to set his opinions in stone. His views did change over time. He often took very different positions on the same issue, and therefore I would say that sort of one has to be careful about sort of naively accepting Churchill's self-presentation as a sort of a die-hard Victorian, which was the image which indeed he was at this point very much trying to play up.
So he was very much cultivating that image and sort of doing that in some way through his text. So you have to take it all with a bit of grain of salt, which again I guess goes back to your point at the beginning about it being a very ironic sort of a book and an enjoyable read. Thanks for tuning in.